here's all the materials you're gonna need to make your hanging macrame plant shelf, as well as an additional plant hanger. We have 2 hanks of rope measuring 95 feet each, 2 wooden rounds, a 7x7 plank for your shelf, and 8 macrame beads for each of your plant hangers. So to begin your macrame plant hanger shelf, you want to grab something to suspend your material off of, a clothing rack, back of a door, back of a chair, some sort of high point that you can tug on. If you have an S-hook, that's gonna help you out as well, or you can tie this up with a piece of string. Grab your wooden round, your hank of rope. You're gonna unravel your hank of rope, and then you want to cut your material to 128 inches, and you're gonna do that 8 times. So I have 8 pieces of rope here that measure 128 inches. Then I take each piece of rope, fold it over, meet it back at the fold, and hang it back up. So I did that 8 times. When folded over, now it appears that you have 16 pieces of rope that should measure about 64 inches each, and your wooden round. In addition to that, you're gonna wanna cut 2 additional pieces of rope that measure about 16 inches each. These are gonna be your top and your bottom knots. So the next part, you're gonna take your 8 folded over pieces of rope, meet them at the middle where they fold over, take half and weave it through your wooden round. Make sure that your bottom ends meet up. And then you want to lay each piece of rope next to the other so that they're not on top of one another. And then go ahead, hang it back up, and then we're going to begin our first knot. So you want to take one of those shorter pieces of rope. These measured about 16 inches, and we're going to do our first knot. This is called a gathering knot, and it's going to happen right here at the top of our plant hanger. So to do a gathering knot, you want to create a little loop, and you're going to have the short end sticking up and the longer end dangling to the side. Take this loop, lay it against your material, take your longer end, and do about 6 gathers. These need to be really nice and tight, and you want to make sure that you have your short frayed end sticking out the top and your loop sticking out the bottom. So you're going to go around about 6 times and make sure they're nice and tight rotations. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're nice and tight and snug. Then I'm going to take my end here that I was gathering with, stick it through the loop at the end. This is where the magic happens. You're going to take this short end sticking out the top, pull it upward, and it starts to disappear inside of your gathers. If this is a little difficult to tug, that means that you did it correctly and that your gathers are nice and tight. Go ahead and get that looped end to rest about halfway through your gathers. Go ahead, check your knot, make sure that it's not moving anywhere. If it's nice and tight enough, then you can grab your scissors and clip these 2 little ends. Go ahead and clip these as close to the gathers as possible without trimming the gathers. All right, so to begin your plant hanger, I'm going to show you a couple knots that we're going to use to create the pattern on the macrame rope. The first knot that we're going to learn is called a square knot. When you do a square knot, you have 4 strands of rope. 2 of those strands remain in the center and they remain stationary. A square knot is consisted of a series of 4s and backwards 4s. To complete one full square knot, you have to do 2 knots that make up one completed knot. I'll go ahead and show you those 2 knots now. So you have your 2 ropes that remain stationary. You're going to start by creating a 4 with your left side rope. So you're gonna lay that left side rope across your center two. You can see this is the beginnings of a 4. Then you're gonna take your right side, lay it on top of the tail of the 4 on the right side. Bring that right side rope behind your center two and forward through the bump of the 4. Tighten it up. Pull your center two ropes to avoid bunching. And that's the first half of your square knot. To complete the second half of the square knot, we need to do the opposite of what we just did. So we're gonna do a backwards 4. Instead of starting with the left side, we are now gonna start with the right side and do the same thing on the opposite side. So we lay this on top of our center two, then we take our left side, lay it on top of the tail, bring this behind your center two ropes and forward through the bump of the 4. This here is one completed square knot. I'm gonna do that one more time just for demonstration purposes before moving over to the macrame rope. So you start with your left side, place it on top of the center two, right side goes on top, bring it behind and forward through. This is your first half of your square knot. To do the second half, we do the opposite, on top, behind, and forward through. And that is a completed square knot. Now we're gonna move over to our macrame cord. What I need you to do is isolate 4 strands of rope. Here we're gonna do a chain of about 8 square knots down these 4 strands of rope. So remember, you have your 2 that remain in the center and your 2 outside strands. If these become confusing, what you can do is drape them aside. That way you are just looking at the 4 strands that you're working with at the moment. And then we're gonna begin our first knot. We wanna position our first knot as close to the gathering knot as possible. So I'm going to create my 4, on top, behind and through. And we're gonna bring that all the way up to the top, nice and tight. Then we're gonna do the second half of the square knot to complete it. We're doing a backwards 4 here, starting with the right side, on top, behind and through. So I have 1 completed square knot, and I'm gonna do that about 8 to 10 more times until I'm happy with the length. So we're gonna go through and do that now. When you get to a point where you think you may be approaching your desired length, if you go through and count the little V's, each V will be 1 square knot. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think I'd like it a little longer, so I'm gonna go to 10 square knots. So I have the first prong of my plant hanger completed with the first portion of knots I'm gonna be doing. This plant hanger is gonna have 4 different prongs, so I wanna go to the rest of my material and isolate another 4 strands of rope. Then I'm going to do the same thing I did on the first prong and do a series of 10 square knots. I have completed my second prong. My knots end up at the same level. Then I can take my plant hanger and rotate it so that I can isolate another 4 strands of rope. Once again, I'm going to do 10 square knots in a row. So completed 3rd prong. Now I'm going to do my final 4th prong with my first series of knots. first part completed. 10 square knots on each prong, 4 prongs all the way around. Now that we have completed the first step, we're going to move on to the next step in our plant hanger, which is adding the wooden beads. To do this, we need to go down about 4 inches. If you'd like to be very precise, you can bring out your tape measure or just eyeball it. Before we put the bead on, we need to ensure that we're going to be getting the most out of our material. You'll notice that the outside strings you were using to create the knots in the first step have become shorter than your inside strings. So to even them out, we want to bring the outside strings to the interior to the exterior, so that we have some new outside working strings that are a little bit longer. Go down about 4 inches or so and use your new outside strings to create 1 square knot. So I have my 1 square knot. I'm going to do that on all sides. Outside to the inside to the outside, and square knot. Now I want to grab one of my prongs, go to the very end of the material and line up your ends. This is where we're going to add on the bead. To make this a little bit easier, you can grab some tape and go ahead and wrap the fringy ends with some tape. This will make it easier to get the ropes through the bead hole. Create a pointy little end. Grab one of your beads and put it on through. You can slide the bead up to your square knot and go ahead and remove that tape from the end. You want to use a tape that's kind of easy to break away. Now you're going to do that for all 4 sides. Putting on the shelf will be our next step. For this, you want to go and do the same thing we did when we were putting the beads on. Match up the ends of each prong of rope and then break out your Scotch tape again. And go ahead and wrap those ends so that they're easier to get through the holes of the plank of wood. Create a nice little pointy end on it with your tape. And go ahead and do that with all 4 prongs. So the next step is going to be adding our shelf. We went through and we taped the ends of each prong. We taped them up so that they're going to be easier to fit through the holes of our shelves. So go ahead and start by putting the material through. So we got one side through. Pay attention to where the prongs lay next to each other. I want to not bring the prong that sits to the right of my first prong. I don't want to crisscross it and bring it to the back. I want to put it in the square that lays to the right. You're gonna have to be a little bit ambidextrous here and hold the rope so that your shelf doesn't fall down at the same time as you put your final ropes through. Right, so that other 16-inch piece of rope that you cut is what we're gonna do our final knot with. So go ahead and grab that 16-inch piece of rope. Make sure that your shelf here is level. Push down on it, and this should measure from your top knot to your bottom knot about 30 inches. Feel like that's pretty level. Now that gathering knot that we did at the very top, we're gonna do it underneath here. So we make a little loop. We lay that against our material with the short end sticking up, the loop out the bottom, and we do about 6 gathers. Make sure to keep holding all your material in your hand so your shelf does not slip. Make sure your gathers are one under the other. I'm gonna push this up so you can see what I'm doing here. So I have about 4 gathers, 5 gathers, 6 gathers. Now you're gonna take your long end and stick it through that loop. Then find your little short end sticking out the top and go ahead and pull that, and you'll see your loop start to disappear, and it's gonna find itself to the middle of your gathers. If it's tight and a little hard to tug to get it to do that, that means that you did it correctly and that knot's not gonna go anywhere. So I can feel that my knot's nice and tight. My gathering knot worked well. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim my excess ends. As close to the gathers as possible without trimming the gathers. Awesome. Now my shelf is nice and level, and you can go ahead and do that very final step and cut your fringe to length. So I like my fringe to have a good amount of length to it. I think 10 inches is plenty. So I can go ahead and cut this all to the same length. All right. And you have completed your hanging macrame plant shelf.